Today I have three books that I selected to read to you. It's, you know, I was going like everybody else into this dark, deep depression because I just wasn't able to read any of the books that I have. And I have hundreds of books that, I've bought and I haven't been able to read. So I've started this exercise where let's see where it goes. I select three random books and I read a random page from them. So let's start with A New Earth by Eckhart Tolle. I have selected randomly, previously, not right now, this section which reads about complaining and resentment. Complaining is one of ego's favorite strategies for strengthening itself. Every complaint is a little story the mind makes up that you completely believe in. Whether you complain aloud or only in the thought makes no difference. Some egos that perhaps don't have much else to identify with easily survive on complaining alone. When you're in the grip of such an ego, complaining, especially about other people, is a habitual and, of course, unconscious, which means you don't know what you're doing. Applying negative mental labels to people, either to face or, more commonly, when you speak about them, to others, or even when you think about them, is often part of this pattern. Name calling is the crudest form of such labeling of the ego's need to be right and triumph over others. Jerk, bastard, bitch. All the definitive pronouns that you can argue with. On the next level down on the scale of unconsciousness, you have shouting and screaming, and not much below that, physical violence. Resentment is the emotion that goes without complaining and mental labeling of people that adds even more energy to the ego. Resentment means to feel bitter, indignant, aggrieved, or offended. You resent other people's greed, their dishonesty, their lack of integrity, what they're doing, what they did in the past, what they said, what they failed to do, what they should or shouldn't have done. The ego loves it. Instead of looking unconscious in others, instead of overlooking unconsciousness in others, you make it to their identity. Who's doing that? The unconsciousness in you, the ego. Sometimes the fault that you perceive in the other isn't even there. Um, so Eckhart Tolle is somebody who is recommended to me by a very good friend of mine, Zermine. And his YouTube videos are actually quite exceptional about how to reframe, how one looks at the world, and how our own consciousness defines our quality of experience, you might say. And so what he argues is that the ego's constant need to be right triumphs over your ability to just accept moments as they are and to not deny a moment its true value, whether it's good or bad, which is pretty much the same principle in most Eastern religions. But try him out. I actually quite like him. I do remember I started off this book long time ago, but I wasn't able to read it to end. I honestly found it a little boring. No offense to Eckhart Tolle. I think his YouTube videos are far more substantially meaningful. The other book is Making Race and Nation by Anthony W. Marks. I bought this book in 1999 in the US. It was one of my first college readings. And when I was moving from college in 2003, after I got married and came to Pakistan, this was one of the books that I kept with me. The reason for that was in my politics book I had, in my class about race and philosophy, I had this really cool professor called Professor Lott in San Jose State University, and he, used to explain how privilege always finds its way into the world. Like, for example, he was African American, and he was tall and lanky, sort of like this character that always plays God in Hollywood. What do you call him? I don't know. He was also in, Bruce Almighty. So he looked like that, and he was a really cool guy. I still miss him, and he always used to say that when the earth is shattered, all the white people will go up into space on their spaceships, and all the black people will be left behind. And I always remember that. I thought, what a bizarre thing to say. And as I grew older and understood race relations, that rang true more than anything else. It's like even when Corona and COVID hit, the first thing that you saw was that the rich people went to their farmhouses and the poor people went off to work, doing the janitorial stuff and the stuff that you can't do away with. Um, so it was so true what he said, and over again, even when it comes to gender and the politics of oppression, Professor Lott and what he said to me always sticks. I'm going to start reading randomly from this page again. Um, this particular chapter talks about the Jim Crow law, which it was really I think it mostly focused on the lynching that used to happen in African American communities, and how it was essentially normalized. Starting from here. Even as radical and significant a figure as Frederick Douglass appears in retrospect to have been somewhat uncertain of how to identify and mobilize blacks after abolition. Douglass advocated assimilation through self assertion and condemned the hypocrisy of American celebrations of freedom amid continued black disenfranchisement. But Douglass also rejected the notion of racial pride, separatist nationalism, and calls for a return to Africa, advocating instead for self reliance and extension of the franchise. He wanted blacks to seek inclusion, though he knew that such demands were unlikely to be met. Having acknowledged the unifying effect of slavery, Douglass seemed less certain of what held blacks together after abolition and the best means to seek redress for their new grievances. Unsure of the basis for continued mobilization, Douglass saw his power dwindle after Reconstruction. I'm sorry, I have a bit of dyslexia, so apologies. Though he lived until 1895. In his wake, the next generation of black leaders would continue to wrestle with how to consolidate black identity, mobilization, and advancement. I'm going to pause here and just say that what I find really interesting about any movement, and especially if you read Malcolm X's book as well, his autobiography, not his autobiography, but the biography that was written about him, you realize that a lot of people who fight oppression only fight it to a certain point. Like once the power dynamics shift, and for example, blacks and whites are equal now, at least according to the law, there's very little imagination of what happens after that, right? I mean, you saw this in Animal Farm in 1985, when George always explains, how the radicals and the people who topple over the oppressors all often become confused after they get power. So it reminds me of that. Going back to the chapter, the leadership mantle was taken by Booker T. Washington, who stressed the assimilation aspect of Douglass's message rather than the popular assertion of black identity. Washington pursued a dual agenda of local black self reliance in the South, while garnering federal patronage and white financial support from Northern liberals, still eager to help. The extent his strategy was consistent with radical separatism, Washington's Africanism remained covert and conservative, at least by most measures. Seeing no opportunity for their political inclusion in the South, where most blacks remained, Washington focused on separate economic advantage as a practical necessity, largely ignoring the link between such advancement and political rights. While Washington may have provided an example for radical pride, he did nothing to channel that pride into mass mobilization. Commentators and later activists would rebuke him, perhaps unfairly, for capitulation to racial domination. Committed to building his own institutional base at Tuskegee Institute for Black Education, Washington abandoned political assertiveness and demands for equal citizenship. He accepted segregation and remained silent on the 1890 force bill, which, had it passed, would have required black enfranchisement. In return, he expected continued financial support, black economic advance, and reduced repression. Washington's near contemporary and eventual successor on the national stage, W.E.B. Du Bois, argued that whites had failed to fulfill their part of Booker T. Washington's bargain. Rather than allowing blacks to advance on their own, Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement had caused further black impoverishment. Du Bois concluded that blacks would have to agitate for the preservation and expansion of their rights, for the integration rather than accept isolation. He assumed that the talented teeth of northern concentrated black elite he represented would lead this effort, expecting they would forego the temptations of accommodation. Yet even Du Bois would compromise at times, for instance, accepting the separate training for black officers in the First World War as preferable to no training at all. When his own support for Woodrow Wilson and black participation in the war effort were left unrewarded, Du Bois began to rethink his position. I'm going to stop here and just make a quick comment. There's a really good Du Bois biography, I believe, by a Rutgers professor, which I just obviously just skimmed over. I'm not a reader of history or politics that much, but he sounded like a lot like somebody who cared about his people. And I think this earlier comment where sometimes he had to rethink his position and that he had to compromise sometimes um, is a surprise to me. Du Bois had long been conflicted over the double self he had described as dividing the loyalties of blacks between America and their race. Concluding that America had abandoned blacks, Du Bois shifted to greater emphasis on race pride, self segregation, and avoidance of self denigrating protest. In this sense, his radicalism echoed Washington's conservatism, but in the Northern tradition, he also became a staunch advocate of black nationalism, using the terms race and nation interchangeably as identities based on common blood and shared experience. Du Bois condemned any mixing of blood that would dilute the black race and create divisions. He feared that the fellow mulattoes would see themselves as intermediaries or even white rather than join the black cause. I believe mulattoes were what you call half castes, so people who were intermarrying between blacks and whites, and their children were called mulattoes. And it's quite a slur, from what I understand, because it's worse than being white because you're polluted or diluted, as some of these texts explain. Back to the text. Radical identity had not yet consolidated to a point where such concerns over absorption would diminish. Blacks remained trapped in the double self of a distinct minority within, yet spurred by white America. How interesting. So I want to keep this brief and leave that with you, just kind of whet the appetite for the reader. My third book is Madame Bovary by Gustav Flaubert. Sounds French. I bought this book because obviously it was considered to be the feminist text to read when it came to fiction. But obviously, as always, I didn't read it because my life tends to have its own sense of chaos. But let's start. I'll try to fake a bit of a French accent just for kicks. As I've had the honor of explaining to your husband, said the chemist, speaking of this poor French yonder who's disappeared, thanks to his extravagance, you will find yourselves in possession of one of the most comfortable houses in Yonville. Its chief convenience for a doctor is that it has a door onto the lane so that people can go in and out without being seen, and it is equipped with all the amenities: wash house, kitchen, and scullery, sitting room, apple loft, and so on. He was a lad who never counted the pennies. He had an arbor made at the bottom of the garden by the river just for him to drink his beer in the summer, and if Madame is fond of gardening, she will be able. My wife doesn't go in for that much, said Charles. She's been advised to take exercise, but she'd sooner stay in her room all the time, reading. I'm the same, remarked Leon. What could be better than a book by the fireside with the wind beating on the window panes and the lamp burning? Excuse the neighbor who thinks that it's okay to hoot like that in the middle of the night. Yes, yes, she said, gazing at him with her great dark eyes wide open. You forget everything, he continued. The hours slip by. You travel in your chair through the countries you seem to see before you. Your thoughts are caught up in the story, dallying with the details or following the course of the plot. You enter into the characters so that it seems as if it were your own, heart beating beneath their costumes. How true, she said. Have you ever had the experience, Leon pursued, while reading a book, of coming upon an idea you've thought of vaguely yourself, some dim picture that returns you to you from the afar and seems completely to express your subtlest feeling? I have felt that, she answered. That is why I'm fondest of poetry, he said. I find it more tender than prose and far more affecting. It pales in time, though, replied Emma. In fact, nowadays I'm all for the stories that rush you along breathlessly and make you frightened. I hate commonplace heroes and moderate feelings such as are to be found in life. Quite so, observed the clerk. Those books which do not touch the feelings seem to me to stray from the true end of art. It is so sweet amidst the disappointments of life to let the imagination dwell on noble characters, pure affections, pictures of happiness. For my part, living here, far from the world, is the one distraction I've got. Yonville has so little to offer. So I obviously really got an F grade on faking the French accent. Um, I think the best I can do was Bonjour, comment allez-vous? Je m'appelle Aisha. That's as far as it go. I did actually get an F in O levels French. I took it because my really good friend was doing such a good job conjugating the verbs, and I thought it was really good. But then I realized I don't possess any skills in that language, or any for that matter. So I hope you liked these three random assortment of books, and that you allow yourself to permeate their words. This is about how to look at the earth. It's really about reframing your point of view. And the lesson from that is stop complaining. Complaining, creates and recreates a reality that doesn't really serve anyone. Um, Race and Nation, we learned about how Du Bois basically was trying to, I think, come up with a middle ground of sort of like freeing the black community from the oppression of the white community, but in the process tended to perhaps go overboard. Especially when he was not very happy about the idea that the mulattoes, were a bad idea, and that mixing of races is a bad idea, and that you should retain your own self identity. I can see why minority groups would want that, but I don't think, again, it helps in the long term. Integration is really about finding the humanity in other people, and what better way to do that than to, bear bond with them. And this is really about a description of the beauty of reading, and I really liked the idea of how they put down the small town. So hope you enjoyed it. Bye.